Hard of belief, we question him again, and all the answers which the man returned to our inquiries in their sense and substance, translated by the feelings which we had, ended in this, that we had crossed the Alps. This is a really important passage in the prelude in Wordsworth, more generally, and of course in all of Romantic poetry. I'm going to read the second stanza here, or at least a portion of it. Imagination, lifting up itself before the eye and progress of my song like an unfathered vapor. Here that power and all the might of its endowments came athwart me. I was lost as in a cloud, halted without a struggle to break through. And now, the immediate moment of the poem, recovering to my soul, I say, I recognize thy glory. In such strength of usurpation, in such visitings of awful promise, when the light of sense goes out in flashes that have shown to us the visible world, the invisible world, doth greatness make abode. There harbors, whether we be young or old, our destiny, our nature, and our home is with infinitude, and only there. With hope it is, hope that can never die, effort and expectation and desire, and something evermore about to be. So yes, I said, here we encounter one of the most talked about, one of the naughtiest passages you're going to find, right? In all this romantic poetry that we've been reading. And it's a moment of profound anticlimax, is it not? This moment. This moment in which the Wordsworth speaker telling his story recalls how he did not have a sublime experience when crossing the Alps. You see how strange this is. This is one of the most important moments in all of Wordsworth. And it's kind of a non-moment, okay? He's expected that it was going to be like climbing Mount Everest. It was just going to be an astonishing sensation of sublime exaltation when he got atop the Alps, but it doesn't work that way, does it? But this is what's really crucial. He does have something like such a heightened moment in the very instant of recollection and reflection upon this moment, okay? So what I ask you to do is to pause to note here how, here again, we have evidence of how, for Wordsworth, some succeeding moment of tranquility in which your moments are recollected. You recall that line from the premise. That's what poetry is, right? Emotions recollected in tranquility. These moments of tranquility in which you do the recollecting of the emotions are always more poetic than the immediate moment when you're feeling the emotions themselves. The emotions themselves are always richer when recovered, recaptured, and contemplated than when originally felt. And I think that this is odder than it's usually given credit for. This is very distinctive and very interesting, and it points to something, I think. We're about to see what. Either way, this moment is worthy of study which might begin by noting how odd, speaking of oddity, it is that the emotion here recollected is one of frustration. It's anything but a typical poetic emotion. It's Wordsworth remembers having found himself on a path descending from the mountain he has already topped unawares. He suffered a kind of emotional whiteout and was stopped, again, emotionally if not bodily, in his tracks. I was lost. This is his condition just after, crossing the Alps and finding himself descending from the Alps on the path. I was lost as in a cloud, halted without a struggle to break through. Disappointment, in other words, is so strong. He's in a cloud of disappointment. It envelops him in a sort of fog, a vapor. When it comes athwart him, halting him in his journey. Again, an emotional, if not an entirely physical journey. In fact, he might still be walking. As he's having this moment of emotional breakdown, an emotional befoggment. You might thus expect, what's going to be the wisdom that Wordsworth's going to take in the moment of the telling of this episode? What is the wisdom he's going to take away from it and communicate to you as a reader? You might expect what he's going to say, what he's going to say about this brief but significant episode, this spot of time. Later in the prelude, Wordsworth speaks of spots of time. You remember reading about those. You might expect him to chalk it up, this little moment of failure, to youthful foolishness. You see, the big mistake was to have such high expectations to begin with, right? You see where such expectations as he had formed of this event, you see where they will get you. Nowhere. Fog-bound in your own deep dejection. Crucially, however, That is not what the narrating poet does. Rather, he pretty much does the opposite. He reports how in this moment of recollection and narration, he sees and feels as well a certain power, not a certain powerlessness and weakness, right, of nature or of himself to rise to nature or what have you, or just as as an agent in the world who can go out and find these moments of, of literal and real and natural power. That's not the focus here. The focus rather is this strange event that occurs, okay, as he's telling the story. In telling the story, he now recognizes, as he says in lines 531 and 532, as he did not during the event itself, that his frustration, okay, is sort of a good thing as it turns out, that he was so frustrated in this moment. His frustration in its intensity and force, because it's just really profound, this sense of frustration, it's a disappointment he has in this moment. This frustration signifies not failure, but triumph, not shame, but glory. I recognize that glory. In feeling so staggeringly bad about missing out on the Alps, he has inadvertently proved the power of mind over matter. Do you see how that might work? That he could be so disappointed, he seems to realize in this moment, suggests that he had imagined an event that real experience never could have lived up to. If he'd actually had the moment atop the mountain, there's no way. I mean, he would have had a version of the same disappointment. There's no way it would have lived up to what he'd made of it as he imagined it ahead of time, right? He had a visiting ahead of time, a visiting, as he puts it in the poem, of awful promise. Okay, awful in the sense of awe-inspiring. And the actual event was just simply not going to live up and be as awe-fulfilling as this feeling he had created ahead of time by way of his imagination, which we're going to talk about in a second. The feeling he had formed ahead of time and expected to feel yet more vividly when actually atop the mountain, he now realizes, was richer than anything he could have felt once there. Hence the force of his dejection when it did not occur, right? If he'd had just mild disappointment, he would have not been able to take away from it what he does. But it's really profound and out of all proportion, the disappointment that he feels and the dejection that then ensues. And from this, believe it or not, you can take away something quite propitious. You can even, in fact, suddenly find yourself, as he does, in a celebratory mood as you meditate now recovering from the feeling of failure, okay, and recognize in the present moment the triumphant power of, yes, again, imagination, right? It is a tribute to his imagination that he created such an expectation, right? And that he felt such dejection when the expectation failed, or the experience failed to live up to the expectation. You get a sense of your power of expectation, your power of imagination in such moments, right? So you can see how he snatches from this, the jaws of this failure, a tremendous sense of victory of mind over matter, as I'll explain in a moment. Imagination, in the form of the dejection, which signifies its subtle presence, he describes as having risen on the descending path, right, as might a cloud. He also describes it as arising in the present tense, in the present moment of his telling the poem, his making the poem up, lifting up itself before the eye and progress of his song, the poem he's now making as he speaks and writes, right? It was with him then, on the path below the peak of the Alps, right, when he was suffering his dejection. It was with him then. Imagination was with him then, in the power of that dejection, in a kind of disguised form, right? You don't immediately feel that dejection and say, oh, it takes a while for him. It's only later in recollection that he can see that the dejection in its intensity is itself a tribute to imagination. But in this moment, this is the moment where he has that payoff, right? It's with him here and now, again, which is a word in the poem, now, even as he writes, and even more powerfully than it was on the path in the disguised form of dejection, is his elation in this moment, right? The mask off, he now recognizes it, imagination, in all its glory. So he doesn't just feel how wonderful imagination is, but also recognizes, is able to say things about it, right? And think about it a little bit and say things about it and its endowments. And speaking of its endowments, note above all how imagination now arises, he says, like an unfathered vapor. Here Wordsworth points to the non-material, non-natural origin of all imagination's feats, right? Because imagination itself is not of natural birth. It's like a vapor that suddenly envelops one, but not one that has any father, has any source. It has no father in this finite life, invisible world. That's what imagination is like. It's like some strange experience where a mist comes out of nowhere. It seems to have given birth to itself, right? Rather than being given birth to by, let's say, some pond, okay, or rain or what have you, or some larger cloud, a piece of which is broken off. Its home is with not some finite thing in the world, but with infinitude. Okay, and all this is a figure, if you're aware of that. Its home is with infinitude. Its abode, the invisible world. That's imagination. That's our conscious souls. That's where they belong. That's where they come from, right? And it's kind of their realm is the realm of infinitude in the invisible world, which are difficult places to actually characterize themselves, aren't they? So Wordsworth stays out of the sphere of infinitude, the sphere of the invisible. But he points to him, doesn't he? So yes, we are bordering on the mystical, as another of you said in your response to one of the items, which you're going to talk about in the next place. First of all, though, before we go there, let's just mention before proceeding, how the natural may appear to have been left behind. Think of Tintern Abbey. We're nowhere near that poem at this point, are we? Speaking of odd, this is Wordsworth. Aren't we supposed to be talking about nature? Yes, indeed, we're bordering on the mystical. You seem to agree. Noah, when he calls upon imagination, Wordsworth shifts from a sensory world to a spiritual revelation, which fits the definition 1a that says, having a spiritual meaning or reality that is neither apparent to the senses nor obvious to the intelligence. This mystical experience, Noah continues, is brought to life by Wordsworth's realization that their physical senses failed to register the immense height of the Alps, prompting the awful power to rise in the mind's abyss and offer a higher vision. I think that's very well said, Noah. Elizabeth, it is mystical as this vision because it came out of nowhere. And Elizabeth, you know I agree. As we saw a plate ago, it arises, quote, like an unfathered vapor. We made a lot out of that, and I think a lot should be made out of that line. Sarah continues, it, quote, has no apparent source. It comes not out of the world as a result of sense experience, the product of contact with the world, the product of inference from our senses, right? But out of the mind, and not the part of the mind that thinks over what we have seen and felt, but out of the mind's depths, its fathomless abyss. So, I mean, the point is that this is not something, right, that you get. This revelation is not something that comes rationally, or it comes intuitively. It just seems to come out of nowhere, as Sarah says, it has no apparent source. And that is part of its nature. That's part of what makes it so wonderful, is it just seems autonomous. In fact, it is in Wordsworth's view. A friendly amendment, by the way, let me offer to Noah, was not the sense of anticlimax, at least arguably, nature's fault, as opposed to the fault of his senses? That's what I was trying to stress. That is, I mean, not as though he pauses over there and says, nature failed me, the way it does in elegiac stanzas. We're not quite there, right? But the celebration is all about like this, this part of himself that rises up upon nature's failure to speak to him. Okay? That is, it's not as if he hit the top of the mountain and failed to see it in its grandeur. That's not what happens. I think you almost suggested that that's the way it worked. And, rather nature, the mountain, provided no suitable overlook. It's not as though, it was a great overlook, but he didn't rise to the occasion. It was really nature not providing much of an overlook and disappointing him accordingly. In a sense, then, nature failed him, not he yet. Either way, though, the critical focus is on the world and the part of us fitted to it not. He's celebrating the part of us that is independent of the world, right? The critical focus, his criticism is aimed, if there's, to the extent that there's explicit criticism, it's aimed at the world and the part of us that's fitted to it. He's celebrating the part of us that's completely independent of it, that rises above it, our conscious soul, the imagination. Well, Ali contributes, the speaker was discouraged before finally realizing that he'd crossed the Alps. Once he finally realized what he did, he recognizes as something greater than him. Ali, I have to differ to this degree. Does the revelation come once he survives a mere delay in appreciating having crossed? See, it's kind of what I was saying to Noah a moment ago. Is it not rather that the revelation comes regardless of having crossed? He comes to realize that the Alps and the crossing of them, okay, and the whole world of things and actions that such, yeah, places like the Alps and other places, all places in the world, and all actions in the world, they matter very little compared to the imagination that typically makes so much of all of it, right? Makes more of it than it could ever live up to. Stephanie continues, in reaching the summit, Wordsworth realizes the great and awful power of the imagination, thus revealing to him with a flash of light the invisible world. Again, good, but would it be more accurate to say that he does so, recognizes that awful power that lifts itself up before him in not reaching the summit? You can see, I really want to make a big, I want to emphasize this, that, this is a moment in which, and it's a rare moment where you actually have him in a natural sphere, okay? You have Wordsworth not celebrating nature. Nature is not the target of the celebration here by any means, okay? It's in not reaching the summit. It's in experiencing the acute disappointment of not doing so, only then to feel just how strong his expectation was. His expectation in the imagination that fashioned it, of how wonderful it was going to be. And it's in the feeling of the discrepancy between those two things, even in a sense, compares the disappointment he feels upon not doing it to any possible wonder he might have felt in so doing it, and finds the former greater. So when Raquel says, so when the speaker says, I recognize that glory after crossing the Alps, he's referring both to the beauty of nature he's experiencing and to the divine as he believes in it. Again, I have to say, good, but more the latter than the former. Raquel, the glory here recognized is more divine than natural. And the divine as it exists in the human mind with its rich, mystical depths. Sarah, quote, it is his imagination that does the job for him, lifting him above the physical world. I could not agree more, Sarah. Allie, note how he shifts. Allie's offering us a kind of capstone on the whole discussion up to this point. Note how, quote, he shifts from talking about a physical journey to describing a powerful internal experience. He speaks directly to imagination, treating it like a divine or spiritual force that rises above normal thought or sight. When he says that this power came athwart me, he means it suddenly came over him, as if he were touched by something greater than himself, but something, by the way, that originates within himself. Thus fits the first definition of mystical, since he's sensing a spiritual truth that cannot be seen or easily explained by reason. Just so. Well, what about that second definition, the mystical? Allie, the experience also matches the second definition, 1b, because Wordsworth seems to feel a deep communion with a higher reality. Noah continues, this moment also corresponds with the other definition, 1b, which says, quote, involving or having the nature of an individual's direct subjective communion with God or ultimate reality. Well, one wonders how direct is this communion? This is something that's just as important to emphasize as the non-celebration of the natural is, as we saw, the limitations of his mysticism, that he does not take a decisive leap into the sphere of the mystic, the sphere of the mystical, the sphere of infinitude in eternity. Wordsworth's focus is on his own conscious soul, not the presence of an oversoul, not some external and independent divine entity whose company he now seeks at the expense of all further participation in the natural world. Once again, Wordsworth's mysticism has its limits. If we define the mystic as one who seeks to enter into the sphere of the invisible, the sphere of infinitude, and leave behind the world of phenomena, the world of phenomenal appearance, the world that we live in, the world that is present to us by way of our senses, I don't know that we do define Wordsworth as a mystic, although he obviously is interested in mystical experience here, there, and elsewhere. This passage I'm about to pay a little bit of attention to is just down the road. It's the ending of this excerpt in our book from chapter 6, or book 6, and it's almost as famous in the discussions of Wordsworth as the one we just talked about. So this is the culmination, and this is what ensues, in a sense, from that passage before, right? The dull and heavy slackening which ensued upon those tidings by the peasant given. You can see this is the aftermath of the scene we just talked about. Those were soon dislodged, and downwards we hurried fast, and entered with the road which we had missed into a narrow chasm. The brook and road were fellow travelers in this gloomy pass. So he's walking down a road this is the descent. This is further along the descent from the Simplon Pass, which is the top. It's the top of the Alp upon which he, had that non-experience. And right next to the road is a brook, like a stream. They are fellow travelers down this pass, as he calls it, down through Simplon Pass as it enters the flat land below the mountain. The brook and road were fellow travelers in this gloomy pass, and with them did we journey several hours at a slow step. And see what happens next. The immeasurable height of woods decaying, never to be decayed. The stationary blasts of waterfalls. These are phenomena that Wordsworth encounters as he makes his way down the road and completely out of the Alps. The stationary blasts of waterfalls, and everywhere along the hollow rent winds, thwarting winds, bewildered and forlorn. The torrents shooting from the clear blue sky, the rocks that muttered close upon our ears, black drizzling crags that spake by the wayside as if a voice were in them, the sick sight and giddy prospect of the raving stream, the unfettered clouds and region of the heavens, tumult and peace, the darkness and the light were all like workings of one mind, the features of the same face, blossoms upon one tree, characters of the great apocalypse, the types and symbols of eternity, of first and last and midst and without end. Well, before I even begin to characterize this passage, I'm going to allow our resident expert, Harold Bloom, to speak. And this is from, again, the Visionary Company. You've seen portions and parcels of this text before. This is what he has to say. So much is brought together so magnificently in this passage that we can read it as a summary of what the poet has to say about the final relation between phenomena and the visible world, which is the same as saying the phenomenal world, which is the world that we inhabit on a daily basis, where senses, give us access to it, and that world beyond all sensation and all perception, which is the world of infinitude, the invisible world that he's talking about in that other passage, right? What is the final relation between these two? This passage gives us some clue of what that should be or what that is for Wordsworth. The woods, as Bloom continues, are constantly in process of decay, but the process will never cease. It will continue into apocalypse. The waterfalls descend and yet give the appearance of being stationed where they are, not to be moved. The winds are antithetical, balancing one another in the narrow chasm, thwarted, bewildered, forlorn. They are humanized by this description. Torrents, rocks, crags participate in the speaking with tongues, and the raving stream takes on attributes of human disorder. Above, the unbound heavens contrast their peace to this torment, their light to this darkness. The above and the below are like the workings of one unified mind, and are seen as features of the same face, blossoms upon one tree, either and both together. For the human and the natural are alike characters of the great unveiling of reality, equal types and symbols of the everlasting, and we could say the infinite and the invisible. And he goes on to give us a little bit of context here by pointing back towards, for example, Tintern Abbey, where you don't really have anything quite this extreme. Well, here's how I would gloss both what Bloom has to say and that which is itself a gloss and the item glossed. Bloom's point is that Wordsworth here reveals with unusual exactness how he feels the visible world of phenomena, the objects we see and hear and whatnot, sense images of which may linger in memory, may suggest or indicate or point to what's not phenomenal, what's mystical, invisible, apocalyptic, eternal. The former, right, phenomena, which is like the tree you're looking at out of your window, and when you turn away from the window, it's that sense image that lingers. The former may serve as a type or as a symbol. We may approach the invisible, that which is not a tree, that which stands behind the tree somehow. We may approach the invisible by way of such a type, such a symbol, such a phenomenal object, viewed symbolically, viewed as a type. For example, eternity, which never-endingness, which you really can't wrap your mind around that, can you? I would put that in the sphere of the invisible and of the infinite, right? It's in that world out there that we don't really have access to, right? In our natural existences, right? Well, how do we get anywhere near that? We're in a world of constant change. Unchangingness, such as one would find in eternity, is literally unimaginable. You think about the universe, we now know everything is in motion, right? With the Big Bang Theory and all that, there's just no such thing as a still point. There was no, to quote T.S. Eliot, still point of the turning world. You can't find a place of stability. It's just inconceivable that such exists. Well, Wordsworth argues, think of stationary blasts of waterfalls. Think of torrents shooting from the clear blue sky. Quoting Bloom, the waterfalls descend and yet give the appearance of being stationed where they are, not to be moved. Do they not somehow thereby give us a sense of stability amidst flux, stillness amidst movement? We see motion, we see change, we also see constancy. These contraries of change and constancy, they seem to combine in this one phenomenon of the stationary blast of the waterfall. And we intuit when we contemplate the waterfall, which is water in motion and water somehow still, like a form of water that we apprehend, which is itself water. We at least have a sort of suggestive image of. We intuit or have some sort of intimation, right, of a paradox, an unchanging world of change, woods decaying, never to be decayed. And we can kind of hold it in our heads, if you see what I'm saying, by way of this image of the stationary blast. We get a little bit of a sense, just an intimation, a kind of inkling, okay, of this truth about the universe that is otherwise unimaginable and unapproachable. All right? So just try to wrap your minds around that. And think about the torrents. The torrents, for their part, they're a little like that unfathered vapor that we talked about in an earlier plate, are they not? They have no visible origin. Right? They seem to come out of the blue, as we say. It came out of the blue. In this case, out of the blue sky. The soul has, if we want to see, okay, perhaps that torrent as somehow a figure of, vitality, the spiritual presence, this presence of the soul on earth with all its vibrancy. The soul has no source on this earth. Its abode is with infinitude, right? The invisible. So is the universe's, which cannot be imagined to start somewhere and end somewhere else. You can see how maybe that torrent coming out of the clear blue sky would enable us to approach the notion. Again, just give us an inkling, just an intimation, no clear concept, but just an intimation of something that stands on its own, that does not seem to have been given birth by anything else, but it just is in a condition of pure, right, pure unmediated being that has no beginning and no end, which is kind of how we think about the universe when we're not thinking of it as, according to the imagery of the Big Bang, right? So this image of the torrent coming out of nowhere and just shooting eternally from the clear blue sky could be an image, again, of this sort of universal, vital universality, or this vital principle in the universe that seems not to have, again, this is staying away from like Christian and other religious approaches to this question, right? It's an attempt to approach this question by way of phenomena in the natural world. And you can see how it might sort of work. Again, just to give you an intimation or an inkling. And so on. We could talk about some other of the images, other of the symbols, the types, the blossoms upon the one tree. That's an image that I'm not going to pause to try to explain in this moment, because there is a limit to how much time we have, isn't there? Okay, let's kind of sum up. The only way on earth, could we say this? This is what we take away from this, what we've just seen. The only way on earth to the invisible, to approach the invisible, right, to encounter the invisible, is by way of the visible, right, the natural. You can't just will your way into the presence of nothingness, right? You have to go through where we are and what we are. Wordsworth, I would argue, and I think I'm not alone, I think Bloom would agree, never gives up on the latter, the natural, the visible. Now, he seems to in that previous play, that passage that we looked at in the previous play, which is a very famous passage out of Wordsworth, doesn't seem to care that much about the natural, the visible, right, the finite. right? But here what we see is that, does this not clarify that if you're going to approach up to the border of the former, which he seems to want to do, he wishes to approach up to the border of the former, right, and not take a final leap into the sphere. You're well positioned to do such a thing because you have before you all this phenomena that can be read. They can be read as symbols. They can be read as types. All these phenomena, right? And what I would suggest is that since Wordsworth seems content with that, it does not seem to want to overgo the border of the former and take a final leap, okay, into the sphere of infinitude. He's not, when all is said, a mystic. Because that's what a mystic wants to do. A mystic wants to enter that sphere, not hang out on its border, enjoying these intimations and these inklings, but nevertheless living, shall we say, a relatively happy life in nature. Because you can imagine if you turn yourself into a confirmed mystic, I don't know, you're going to stop eating. You're just going to give up on the world, the body, everything that we do, all the people that we love in the world. And Wordsworth's he's not willing to do that. Okay, one last plate on this video. I've decided to break, in fact, what was going to be one very long micro lecture into two, okay, which is the usual routine. I'll explain this in an announcement. But here's the last plate. This is that final passage that you just can't leave this epic behind without saying something about it, okay? And it's the famous moment atop Mount Snowdon that I think you're going to find pairs up nicely and interestingly with what we just talked about, right? The business with the Simplon past. This is climax, many people feel, of the entire poem. And it's when Wordsworth is climbing a mountain, and this time the mountain doesn't fail him. Instantly a light upon the turf fell like a flash. He's up on this hill, and he's just come through the woods and is walking out into a kind of overlook. I looked about, and lo, the moon stood naked in the heavens at height immense above my head. And on the shore I found myself of a huge sea of mist, which meek and silent rested at my feet. 100 hills, their dusky backs upheaved all over this still ocean, and beyond, far, far beyond, the vapors shot themselves in headlands, tongues, and promontory shapes into the sea, the real sea, as opposed to the figurative sea that he's just reported, that seemed to dwindle and give up its majesty, usurped upon as far as sight could reach. Okay, so this is that complicated little passage. It's very tricky, right? And continues, of course, when we get here to the moon in the next line, which I've highlighted a bit or enlarged. Let me quickly just mention that you can see where it is that the answer to that one quiz question came from, right? It's not a real sea, except in the great distance where you can't really see it. What he's looking down on, as he says, okay, these dusky backs of 100 hills, which are covered in a huge sea of mist, but not a literal sea. The real sea is at great distance and it's dwindled and is not very majestic. He can barely see it, right? It's way out there. So what he's looking down on, are mountains, right? And it's a huge sea of mist. It can seem as though what we're about to note below is that amidst all this vapors and the vapor and this mist and all this, he hears this loud sound which emanates from a break in the vapor, a break in the cloud, basically, that he's above the clouds and he's looking down on them. And he hears the sound come up through the clouds. And I can imagine how you might think, because you hear the phrase the roar of waters, that he's hearing rivers, but it's actually little streams. It's not big rivers. It's just those little streams, such as the one he saw at Simplon Pass. And he hears torrents, which are more like, waterfalls, right? So just to give you an indication quickly of where it is, this was a tricky question, wasn't it? Much trickier than it first appeared. But it's very important to get and to understand exactly what he is seeing, really seeing, and therefore, or thereby to pay the fit tribute you should to his imagination. His imagination transforms things into this sort of border space, right? We talked about the border figures. Every figure in this scene down below him is a border figure that seems to merge and melt into other figures. And right, there does not seem to be these sharp distinctions between the mist and those 100 hills, their dusky backs upheaved all over this, as he sees it, still ocean. All right, let's continue line 52. Meanwhile, the moon looked down upon this show in single glory, and we stood, the mist touching our very feet, and from the short distance, not the third part of a mile, was a blue chasm. Here's that break in the clouds, a fracture in the vapor, a deep and gloomy breathing space, through which mounted the roar of waters, torrents, streams, innumerable, roaring with one voice. Again, all those distinctions and differences are merged, melted, and we get the one voice that speaks through this break in the clouds. The universal spectacle throughout was shaped for admiration and delight, grand in itself alone, but in that breach through which the homeless voice of waters rose, this made it yet grander. The dark, deep thoroughfare had nature lodged, the soul, the imagination of the whole. And he has this meditation, as you might imagine, that follows, because he usually does follow up. We have like little micro instances of subsequent tranquility in which more immediate emotions are recollected and meditated upon. And sure enough, he reports that a meditation rose in me. And this one rose actually in the scene, and not now as he's sitting here, although he's recollecting that meditation. As we saw in the Simple and Pass, at the very top, where he gets the meditation is later. It's when he's sitting down and writing the poem. But here it's in that moment, in that night. A meditation rose in me that night upon the lonely mountain when the scene had passed away. And it appeared to me the perfect image of a mighty mind, of one that feeds upon infinity, that is exalted by an underpresence, the sense of God or whatsoever is dim or vast in its own being. Above all, one function of such mind had nature there, exhibited by putting forth in that which circumstance most awful and sublime. And he goes on from there. Well, here's a quick Daniel Stemple gloss on what it is that we've just read. And what you're going to find down below is I'm going to be, I wouldn't say disagreeing with Stemple, but making sure that we don't misunderstand him. He says, Stemple, Wordsworth describes how he stood on the peak of Mount Snowdon and was granted a revelation, which, quote, appeared to me the perfect image of a mighty mind, which we just read, of one that feeds upon infinity. Stemple is keen to point out that no divine voice hidden in darkness spoke to him on the mountaintop. His revelation was a vision, a sudden illumination, as he broke through the mist shrouding the mountain and emerged into a flood of moonlight. For instantly a light upon the turf fell like a flash. I looked about and lo, the moon stood naked in the heavens. Stemple goes on, as in Tintern Abbey, nature, using the language of the sense, spoke to him. Even at this supreme moment, Wordsworth obediently and wisely remains within the familiar limits of the poetry of nature allotted to him by Coleridge, etc. Yeah, yes and no, I think, Professor Stemple. Because I think what at least I am about to argue, and I think a lot of people would agree with me about this, is that it's a little bit of a misleading statement to say that nature, using the language of the sense, speaks to him here. Okay, as though nature is itself the the ultimate interlocutor, the ultimate partner he's having in this experience. Because I don't think that's quite true. What I think happens instead is something speaks through language. Language is itself that language. Nature is itself the language of the sense. And it is through nature and its symbols that something beyond the infinity, eternity, which he encounters up here in the mountains, speaks to him. And let me explain what I mean by this. Go back. Note how this passage may appear to negate everything we were taught by the climactic events of Book 6 that we've been exploring in the last couple of plates. Nature at best subordinated there, if not left out of account altogether, as I think it is, not in the passage where he's descending, but rather pretty much descended, right? And he sees all those characters and types and tokens and symbols of the great apocalypse, but rather atop the mountain. Nature is not really talked about much there. It's more the imagination, the frustration that nature visits upon him by not living up to his image of it. Sparks this sort of celebration of imagination, which comes to his rescue. It kind of causes his downfall and then picks him up. But nature being, not celebrated there, here pushes its way back, I think you would agree, ostensibly into the center of his song, his celebration. Quote, in that breach through which the homeless voice of waters rose, had nature lodged, the soul, the imagination of the whole. Nature is here celebrated as the active agent of the revelation, the soul being lodged. Nature does the lodging. Stemple up above said nature does the speaking. Let's go on. The soul being lodged, nature does the lodging. Nature could be said had failed him as he made his way through the Simplon Pass. Here atop Snowdon, not so. It rises to the occasion. This is the Stemple reading. Again, I think he's more or less right, but there's a little, it seems to me, mistaken emphasis upon nature that can be taken to indicate that nature is all itself that he encounters in this moment and nothing beyond nature. And I think that's a big mistake to see it that way. You don't really want to, leave out of the celebration entirely that which speaks through nature, as we will see here shortly. Note that nature here's the point. Nature is just a vehicle. It's an hotelier, as the French would put it, merely a hotel, provider. It provides lodging. It's maybe an event planner. You could say nature is in the scene. An exhibitor at some convention. An imager. The exhibit itself, the thing imaged, okay, the thing being lodged, being the soul, the imagination of the whole, which is right there unobtrusively sitting in line 65, right at the end of that paragraph, the end of that stanza. Got that? Okay. The thing being imaged, the thing being lodged, the thing being brought by way of the vehicle, okay, is the soul, okay, the imagination of the whole. Not to mention that mighty mind that he speaks about, one that feeds upon infinity, which we've already read about a couple of times. As I would argue, as when Wordsworth meditates upon characters of the great apocalypse, the types and symbols of eternity, this is descending and pretty much descended Simplon Pass. And that second passage that we took from Book 6 and looked at carefully is when he meditates upon characters of the great apocalypse. You remember this, we just talked about it. The types and symbols of eternity is presented during the Simplon Pass descent. So here, too, he sees signs, tokens, symbols, right? That's what nature provides. The moon, most of all, which is here personified as something most awful and sublime. Nature presents those symbols. Nature is credited accordingly. It presents the moon, one such. In the later 1850 version of the poem, Wordsworth makes that very explicit indeed. He calls the moon the emblem of a mind that feeds upon infinity, that broods over the dark abyss. Thus again, nature's celebration here is very rich. Let's make no mistake, but let's not go to the other extreme. It's a limited celebration in this sense, that a sense of God is what Wordsworth is after atop Snowdon. Now, only nature can provide such, right? Without that moon, you get no intimation. You have no emblem of that mind that fits upon infinity, without nature providing you with one. But nature itself, though cherished, is not an object of worship. And it's a big mistake to see Wordsworth as a pantheist, if you've seen that word, as a worshiper of nature who doesn't look beyond nature and listen to what is beyond nature that speaks through nature. Okay, that's why I have a little difficulty with the way Stemple puts it up above. Nature, using the language of the sense, spoke to it. If it did, I think it spoke in tongues. Rather, it gave voice, it gave tongue. Sounds a bit crude, but you get the point. It gave a tongue to God, or whatsoever, that underpresence. Okay, well, that's enough. I like, by the way, that phrase, God or whatsoever. It's a little bit like saying, hey, I got up into the mountains and I heard, by paying close attention to nature and what it was saying to me, I heard the voice somehow speaking through, speaking as in tongues, right? Which harkens back to the Pentecost, Christian Pentecost. Speaking as in tongues, I heard the voice of God. I heard God himself speak to me. God, or whatever you want to call that underpresence, as he puts it. Again, enough for today. These plates have been fairly lengthy ones. You got a second video micro lecture coming to cover some interesting issues in Coleridge that are worth studying and knowing something about before the midterm. Bye for now.